The Drawn Betrayer. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace stood before a court at Westminster Hall in London. The Scottish rebel leader had evaded English forces for years, but now he was in chains, convicted of treason against a king he had never sworn allegiance to. His sentence was designed not just to kill him, but to destroy the legend he had become. At Smithfield, a crowd gathered to witness his punishment. Wallace, 35, was tied to a hurdle, a wooden panel, and dragged by horses through London's streets. The stones tore at his back and limbs, but this was merely the beginning. The real torment awaited at the execution ground. Upon arrival, Wallace was still conscious. Executioners strung him up on a gallows, but before suffocation could claim him, they cut him down. Survival at this stage was not mercy, it was calculation. The worst was yet to come. As Wallace lay gasping for breath, the executioners stripped him naked. With practiced precision, they used a knife to cut open his abdomen. His intestines were pulled out slowly, foot by foot, and placed in a brazier to burn. Wallace watched his own organs turn to ash before his eyes. The executioners then reached deeper into his abdominal cavity, extracting his heart. This too was cast into the flames as Wallace's vision began to fade. Blood loss and shock were finally granting him release, but the executioners weren't finished. With Wallace now dead, they severed his head with a single axe blow. His body was divided into 4 parts. Each quarter would be sent to a different corner of Scotland as warning: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and placed on a spike on London Bridge. The English believed this brutal spectacle would extinguish Scotland's resistance. Instead, Wallace's execution became a rallying cry. His dismembered body was gone, but the story of his death would inspire Scottish independence for generations to come. Martyred in the Cathedral. On December 29, 1170, Archbishop Thomas Becket prepared for evening prayers at Canterbury Cathedral. Once the closest advisor to King Henry II, Becket had become the king's greatest rival, defending church authority against royal power. He had recently returned from exile, but the tension between crown and clergy remained unresolved. As twilight fell, 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, arrived at the cathedral. They had heard Henry's frustrated outburst days earlier. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The knights took these words as command rather than complaint. The knights first confronted Becket in his chambers, demanding he submit to the king's authority. When Becket refused, they retreated briefly to arm themselves. Monks urged the 52-year-old archbishop to hide, but he refused, proceeding instead toward the main altar. The knights burst into the cathedral, chainmail rattling in the sacred silence. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king?" they shouted. "Here I am," Becket replied. "No traitor to the king, but a priest of God." The first blow struck Becket's shoulder as he stood defiant. The second knight swung, connecting with the side of his head. Becket staggered, but remained standing. "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to embrace death," he said. The third blow was decisive. A sword struck with such force that it sliced through Becket's skull, the blade shattering against the stone floor. The crown of his head was severed, blood and brain matter spattering across the altar steps. A final thrust pierced his fallen body, the sword tip breaking against the pavement. One knight placed his foot on Becket's neck and scraped brain matter onto the cathedral floor, declaring, "This traitor will never rise again." The ghastly favorite. On November 24, 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger faced the consequences of his ambition. For years, he had been King Edward II's closest advisor and likely lover, amassing enormous wealth and power. When Queen Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer invaded England, Despenser's fall was inevitable. Captured while attempting to escape by sea, the 40-year-old Despenser was brought to Hereford for a show trial. No real defense was permitted. His sentence reflected not just his crimes, but the hatred he had inspired among England's nobility. The execution began with ritual humiliation. Despenser was stripped and dressed in a tabard painted with his coat of arms, reversed to signify treachery. A crown of nettles was placed on his head. Then, tied to 4 horses, he was dragged through the crowded streets of Hereford, the rough ground tearing at his naked flesh. At the execution site, Despenser was only beginning to understand what awaited him. Still fully conscious, he watched as executioners prepared their implements: knives, fire, and ropes. He was hung from a gallows 50 feet high, but deliberately not to death. The rope was cut before his neck broke. As he gasped for breath, they laid him on a table. First, they removed his genitals with a knife and threw them into a brazier before his eyes. Then they cut open his abdomen, slowly drawing out his intestines and other organs, which were also burned as he watched. His stomach heaved, but there was nothing left to vomit. Witnesses reported a ghastly, inhuman howl that emerged as his heart was cut out and thrown into the same fire. Dispenser's eyes remained open, somehow still showing life even as his existence ebbed away. Only then did the executioners behead him, mounting his head on London Bridge. His body was quartered, the parts displayed in Bristol, Dover, York, and Newcastle. Blood in the Sanctuary. On February 10th, 1306, John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, entered the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries for what he believed would be a peaceful meeting. Known as the Red Comyn for his hair color or perhaps his Norman ancestry, he was a powerful Scottish nobleman and a rival to Robert Bruce for Scotland's contested throne. Bruce had arranged this meeting, suggesting they discuss matters of mutual interest. Both men left their swords outside the church, respecting the sanctity of holy ground. The cold stone interior of the small church seemed to promise safety. No blood had ever been spilled within these walls. As they stood before the high altar, their conversation quickly turned to Scotland's future. Bruce proposed they join forces against the English. Comyn refused, reminding Bruce that he had sworn fealty to King Edward I. According to some accounts, Comyn threatened to expose Bruce's plans for rebellion. Bruce's face darkened with rage. Without warning, he drew a dagger from his belt and plunged it into Comyn's chest. The blade penetrated deeply, but did not immediately kill. Comyn fell to his knees, blood seeping through his clothing and onto the church floor. Staggering away from Bruce, Comyn collapsed near a side altar. The friars rushed to his aid, dragging him toward the altar to administer last rites. Blood trailed across the stone floor as they moved him. Bruce, shaken by what he had done, retreated outside. There he encountered his companions, including Roger Kirkpatrick, who asked what had happened. "I doubt I have killed Comyn," Bruce admitted. "Then I'll make Secker," Kirkpatrick replied. "I'll make sure." Kirkpatrick entered the church with Bruce's kinsman Christopher Seaton. They found Comyn still alive, receiving comfort from the monks. Without hesitation, they fell upon the wounded man with their daggers. Comyn's uncle, Sir Robert Comyn, rushed to intervene but was cut down as well. The Red Comyn died on consecrated ground, his blood staining the church floor. Boiling betrayal. On August 31st, 1375, William de Cantilupe retired to his bedchamber at Scotton Manor in Lincolnshire. The 29-year-old nobleman had finished his evening prayers and dismissed his attendants, believing himself secure within his own walls. The heavy wooden door was barred, and his household staff were nearby, seemingly loyal and vigilant. As midnight approached, Cantilupe was awakened by the sound of the door being forced open. In the dim candlelight, he recognized 3 servants entering his chamber, men in the employ of Thomas Lovell, Richard Geiss, and John Cook. These men had plotted against their master for weeks, their motives a web of greed and old grievances. Cantilupe reached for his dagger, but the assassins were already upon him. The first blow struck his chest, piercing between his ribs. He cried out, but the thick stone walls muffled his screams. A second knife plunged into his abdomen, and a third into his throat. Blood poured onto the bedsheets as Cantilupe fought desperately for his life. For nearly 2 minutes, the attackers continued their assault, delivering more than a dozen wounds. Cantilupe's struggles gradually weakened until he lay motionless, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above. The servants confirmed he was dead, but their grim task was not complete. From the kitchens, they brought a cauldron of water that had been heating over the fire. With methodical precision, they poured the scalding liquid over Cantilupe's wound. Steam rose from the body as the boiling water sealed the gashes, preventing blood from seeping through the clothing or wrappings during transport. The murderers then wrapped the corpse in linens, the hot water ensuring blood would not betray their movements. The body was still warm, not from life, but from the cruel ministrations that followed death. They carried Cantilupe's remains from the manor, intending to dispose of the body in a location that would implicate others. By dawn, the plotters had vanished, leaving behind only blood-stained bedsheets and the lingering smell of copper and steam. The Hour of Agony. On March 28, 1757, Robert François Damiens stood on a scaffold in the Place de Grève in Paris. The 42-year-old former servant had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV 2 months earlier, inflicting only a minor wound with a small knife. For this act, he would endure a punishment so severe that witnesses would still recount it decades later. At 4:00 p.m., the execution began with a public confession. Damien's right hand, the one that had held the knife, was burned with sulfur. His flesh sizzled and blackened, the smell causing spectators to cover their noses. Damien screamed, but the worst was yet to come. Executioners stripped him naked and secured him to a specially constructed table. With red-hot pincers, they methodically tore flesh from his thighs, arms, and chest. Into these wounds, they poured a mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and melted wax. Each application brought fresh screams that echoed across the square. Damien's remained conscious through it all. Physicians periodically checked his condition, not to ease his suffering, but to ensure he remained alive to feel every moment. Spectators reported that he continued to speak, sometimes begging for death, sometimes calling out to God. After these tortures, executioners attached thick ropes to each of his limbs. The other ends were tied to 4 strong horses, each facing a different direction. At the signal, the horses pulled. Damien's joints stretched and dislocated, but his limbs did not separate as intended. For 30 minutes, the horses strained without success. The executioners, growing impatient, used knives to cut into Damien's joints and tendons, severing the connecting tissues that kept his body intact. One by one, his limbs were torn away. He was still breathing after losing both arms and one leg. Only when the final limb was removed did Damien's suffering end. His trunk, still showing signs of life, was thrown onto a pyre and reduced to ashes. The entire execution had lasted over an hour. The Pope's cruel end. On September 7, 1303, Pope Boniface VIII awoke to shouts and the clash of weapons in Anagni, his birthplace and papal retreat. The 73-year-old pontiff had been engaged in a bitter power struggle with King Philip IV of France, even threatening to depose him. Now Philip's men, led by Guillaume de Nogaret and Italian allies, had breached the papal residence. Hearing the attackers approaching, Boniface did not flee. Instead, he donned his full papal regalia, the mantle of St. Peter, the imperial crown, and holding the keys of St. Peter and a cross. "Since I am betrayed like Christ," he declared, "I shall die as Pope." The attackers burst into his chambers, finding the Pope seated on his throne. For 3 hours, they hurled insults and threats while Boniface remained silent and motionless. Then Sciarra Colonna, whose family had been persecuted by the Pope, struck Boniface in the face with a mailed gauntlet. The metal-covered fist crashed against the elderly man's cheekbone and temple, drawing blood. The attackers imprisoned Boniface in his own palace. For 3 days he received no food or water. Witnesses reported seeing Nogaret repeatedly slap and humiliate him. When finally released by the citizens of Anagni, Boniface was no longer the commanding figure who had once declared himself above all earthly kings. Returning to Rome under guard, Boniface showed signs of deterioration beyond physical injuries. He experienced periods of confusion, slurred speech, and seizures, symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury. His cheekbone remained visibly deformed where Colonna's gauntlet had struck. For 5 weeks, Boniface's condition worsened. He developed a high fever and became increasingly disoriented. In lucid moments, he spoke not of revenge, but of the humiliation he had endured. A pope, God's representative on earth, struck like a common criminal. On October 11th, attendants found Boniface in his bed, rigid with his eyes open, having apparently suffered a seizure during the night. The pope who had claimed authority over all earthly rulers died alone, his final hours unwitnessed.